this second part of the public lecture. But before going into the second part, I'll show you, all of you, this is the fifth book written by Professor Amrith. Just a few days ago, it was published. This is a title is that the Burning Earth, a History. So now I would like to ask Professor Kanda to make a comment and also some questions to Professor Amrith. So please start your comment.
Thank you very much, Wakimura sensei. First of all, I'd like to congratulate on this special award. And then it's a great honor to be invited to participate in this special lecture today. It was in 2011 we first met. You mentioned about a conference of South Asia's Sustainable Human Sphere. One of the organizers was Wakimura sensei here. And then, so it was, in 2011. And then second time we met I think in 2018. It was international meeting held by Professor Tomoko Shiroyama, the University of Tokyo, which is about the hydrosphere of modern Asia. We have shared the interest in water and the relationship water and development in modern Asia. So actually we learned a lot from your books, articles, talks, and discussions since then. So let me start with my first visit to Singapore. It was in 1989 in March. So you were maybe you were a school kid. That time I went there because my father was working there for Japanese shipbuilding and shipping companies. And then I visited him, and then I was so excited to experience such very Asian atmosphere in Singapore, and which we couldn't experience in Japan at that time. So my father's life there was surrounded by Asian people of diverse origins. So I got really interested in the history of such diversity, ethnic diversity in Singapore. So there, I also encountered the South Asian world in Singapore. As you showed, there's some pictures in your lecture that I visited so-called Little India, and then richly colored Hindu temples that overturned my image of temples, which should be very calm and dark colored. So very different. So, and I got interested in South Asian world beyond Singapore and beyond the Bay of Bengal at that time. I was an undergraduate student, and then so I have been fascinated by the history of Asia in general, especially South Asia. And then so next year I decided to visit India. So so Singapore is the very beginning of my career, as I've been working on the economic and social history of Bengal, modern day Bangladesh, and state of West Bengal of India. So Singapore has been such a hub connecting people of various Asian regions. So this reminds us of the importance of this place, Fukuoka, and maybe Kyushu in general. Fukuoka is known as the gateway to Asia for the Japanese. And I feel the Asian atmosphere here, which I experienced 30 more years ago when I first visited Singapore. And then actually we have a long history of cultural connection among people who live in the maritime area of East Asia, including the Sea of Japan, Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, and also South China Sea. So in history, of course, some moved voluntarily, but others were forced to move. And knowledge and technologies have also circulated in the area. So environmentally speaking, we also share similar climate conditions. This summer we experienced the hottest but wettest summer in history. And as Sunil-san showed the picture of the number of cyclones, the number is growing recently. And here we have many typhoons. And recent ones are not only stronger, but also involving many countries at one time. You remember the recent one, the Typhoon 14, the Typhoon Pulusam, maybe Pulusam. Yeah, passed Okinawa Islands and went westwards and landed in China. Then somehow it moved eastwards and then came to Korea and Japan. So very unpredictable. So in a sense, we share not only the physical damage or the traffic confusion, but also at the same time, the same fear, anxiety, and also life-threatening experiences caused by unpredictable typhoons. So my question is related to this region. And then in your talk, you emphasize the importance of the thinking of a region beyond one country or one regional divisions, and such as South Asia or Southeast Asia, and the significance of history at the same time. So I want to ask you how we, the people of these East Asian countries, can build up the wider regional identity, which seems to be crucial to solve many economic, social, or economic environmental problems. So how do we learn from the history of the Bay of Bengal to help to solve East Asian problems? That is my first question.
Thank you so much, Kanda-san, for that really thoughtful, wonderful comment. One of the interesting things about the Bay of Bengal region is, of course, it has always been connected to this side of the sea. And one of the reasons a place like Singapore becomes so strategically and culturally important is precisely because it is in a way a sort of hinge point of the entire, what we now call the Indo-Pacific world. And so you start to see those interactions from very, very early moment. And I think we can do much more to put those histories together. And I think one way to do that may be to focus on these gateway cities, places like Fukuoka or Singapore, or any of the port cities in South Asia, maybe somewhere like Colombo. And there's a lot of the scholarship on port cities, I think, has been very interesting because it draws a different map. It shows that these port cities are often more connected to each other sometimes than they're connected inland. And so there's a different set of relationships that you can trace if you focus on those kinds of maritime exchanges. And I think that we can learn a lot from that. I think there have been some efforts to tell those stories in museums, for example. I think it remains the case that most school students in most parts of Asia don't learn so much about the neighboring regions. certainly I know that in Singapore and in India, students would learn local history and European history or American history, but Singaporean students would know nothing about the history of Thailand, or let alone India. So I feel like from a young age in the education system, that's probably where we can start to foster this sense of a shared regional identity based on our understanding that exchange has been so deep in this part of the world.
Thank you very much. I remember that you said home is not your country in the talk you gave somewhere, and so can we have develop such kind of identity beyond one country? So you said earlier education is important. So maybe Japan, not only Japan, but in many countries, we should learn that national history and also the regional history. Do you agree?
I do agree, and I think we run into problems when we start to see national identity as opposed to a broader regional identity or even a smaller local identity. And I think that what so many of us have together been working towards in doing this kind of Asian scholarship, looking across borders, is to understand that these identities often productively intersect with one another. So it's not so much about replacing one with the other, but rather maybe to fight against the idea that everything has to be either or, and to encourage a sense turning to history and reminding ourselves and young people today that there's a deep history of people having multiple identities. And I think that's one of the reasons why the sort of longue durée of Asian history and a place like Fukuoka is so fascinating. It's because in some ways it seems to us that we may even need to learn from the openness of past societies and unlearn some of the closed-mindedness which almost every society that we know, including societies in the West, have turned towards more recently.
Thank you. So I'm wondering how your interest in people's movement across the water and developed into the interest in the environment, especially water. At first glance, there are two separate issues. So can you connect these two issues?
That's a great question. When I first started working on migration, I did not have any intention of including environment. In fact, I would say almost the opposite. I think I was trained in a social history tradition where if you were talking about migration, you wanted to emphasize people's agency and imagination. And if we talked too much about climate, there was always the risk of repeating an older style of explanation, which maybe gave too much power to climate. And this was, of course, how many British colonial officials, they used to write about Indian migrants as people who were simply pushed by the monsoon. And so I certainly wanted to resist that. So if anything, I would say that when I started working on migration, I would probably have wanted to avoid talking about questions of climate. What changed my own trajectory was doing fieldwork, spending a lot of time in small coastal towns in Tamil Nadu, but also in Southeast Asia. And I was there to study the past, I was there to study history, I was there because these were places a lot of migrants had left. But when you're there, you can't avoid the problem of water. I mean, it seemed to me overwhelming as a risk, as a concern, as something people were talking about. And that made me realize that, of course, the nature of the water problems we face now are in many ways new, particularly those that are connected with climate change. But being there made me realize that we can't leave out the question of the natural environment even when we're thinking about migration in the 19th century. And maybe we can do that without falling back into an older way of thinking where you are reducing the autonomy and the imagination of people by simply talking about the climate as if it is dominating everything. So rather, I think so many of us have been thinking more about how cultural responses to climatic risks and threats. And so that's how those two things came together for me.
So I found that both the movement of people and water both flow beyond international boundaries and nation states. So are they related to each other in your total interest?
I think definitely so, because I think that tension is a profoundly important one in modern history between the movement, the natural movement of water, of species, of birds, and of course of people, and the modern desire to contain those movements within national borders. And so one of the issues I was very interested in my book, Unruly Waters, of course, is dam building. And dam building, it seems to me, is it's a classic example of trying to make water fit within national boundaries by diverting rivers, by channeling their flow in such a way that they can be used, of course, to serve the national interest. But then we see how problematic that has been in South Asia, where so many of these are transboundary rivers. You see this in Southeast Asia with the Mekong. And as soon as that mentality of nationally controlling water arises, of course, you have great consequences for the other countries that are downstream. And so I think there's always that tension. We know that so many of these climatic forces make nonsense of the borders that we draw. And at the same time, I think that desire to control them is stronger than ever before, whether we're thinking about geoengineering, whether we're thinking about all of the very, very large technological schemes that are being suggested at the moment to deal with some of the water problems that we face. They're still very much framed in terms of control. And of course, the flip side of that is migration control. And if we take a very, very long-term view, migration is a very natural phenomenon. People have always moved around. And so one of the things that's been very striking, of course, about the last 100 years in particular is sort of more and more intensive control over human mobility.
So in your lecture, you talked a bit about growing number of maybe would-be climate refugees, and so a growing number of people would become forced to be such environmental migrants or climate refugees. So how do we accept and protect the lives of the vulnerable within the framework of nation states? So what do we treat them in the same way as political and economic refugees? Or so we might become environmental migrants in the near future. We ourselves. So
I think that last point, Kanda-san, is the important one, because I think it's important to promote the sense that all of us are vulnerable. The idea of having to leave one's home is even a real risk now in developed and wealthy countries. And so I feel like the more that can be used to build empathy and solidarity with those who are, of course, going to be much more affected by these because they don't have the same level of resources to protect themselves. I think that sense of empathy and shared risk is going to be important. I think the other thing to bear in mind is certainly in the West, I think the way that climate refugees are talked about is very misleading, because we know that the 90% of people who are displaced by climate change will be moving within their own countries. Almost all of them are going to be moving within the poorer countries in the global south. And so there is a rhetoric in America, for example, suggesting that all of these people are going to try to come to America. That's just not true. And in fact, the countries and the cities, often cities, that have to accommodate these large numbers of new arrivals are, of course, cities which already have quite strained infrastructure. If you think of a city like Dhaka, which you know well, Sayako-san, it's going to be places like that I think bear the burden more than wealthy countries. So I think whatever the international community can do to create a greater sense of empathy and solidarity, in a sense that actually this can happen to anybody, and to destigmatize migration, I think is really important. Unfortunately, the problem with expanding our definition of refugees further to include environmental refugees is, of course, there have been so many tightening restrictions on political refugees that if that category is actually becoming smaller and smaller and more difficult to claim for, then perhaps we need to also imagine an entirely different vocabulary for thinking about what's going to happen to those people, maybe any of us, who find that climatic conditions make it difficult to stay where we are.
And Singapore is now, economically and financially growing fast, and then Singapore is one of the international financial hubs that attract people and investment money. So, and Japan was once praised as Japan's #1, although somewhat ironically, but anymore. So, does the government of Singapore or the other organizations take any initiative to solve this problem, like in advance?
Yeah, I think the Singapore government, which is very unusual because I think compared with many governments, the Singapore government is able to take a very long-term view. Singapore has elections, but the elections have fairly predictable outcomes, so they don't have the same concerns as governments in other countries where the government might change very quickly. And so Singapore has always been able to do long-term planning, and of course that may have come with costs in terms of democracy. But as far as climate change is concerned, I think Singapore has extremely elaborate plans, not all of which are sort of publicly available or announced, understanding that this is going to be a risk for Singapore and understanding that it'll take a lot of resources to protect Singapore from a very, very rapidly changing environment. There are many infrastructure projects, including the classic solutions of large barrages and seawalls, but Singapore is, of course, a place where very futuristic thinking tends to flourish, and so they're already imagining underwater settlements. They're imagining completely different ways of living. What Singapore is unlikely to do is to open its borders to people who are vulnerable in, say, Indonesia. That is very unlikely to happen. So I think there's a much more of a sense of fortifying Singapore. And I think Singapore government is thinking about ways in which it can maybe invest and provide aid to neighboring countries, but that won't be by welcoming migrants.
Thank you very much. So very different topic. So your mentor was Professor Chris Bailey, and actually Professor Bailey was one of my PhD examiners. So and then he was so how to say he nurtured a generation of scholars, of historians, working not only on India, South Asia, but also other Asian regions. And so how did you choose Professor Bailey as your supervisor of your thesis?
I was very lucky to have been taught by Professor Bailey and also by his wife, Susan Bailey, a great anthropologist. As an undergraduate student, I went to their lectures, and in fact, I have to say that attending Professor Bailey's lectures when I was 18 or 19 years old was one of the things that first made me really, truly interested in history. And so, in a way, I followed that trajectory and that inspiration. But I think you're very right that he nurtured many generations of scholars. And I think for me that he's a model of a very generous supervisor. And one of the things that was most interesting to me about Professor Bailey is he was just not interested in his students doing the same kind of work he did. In fact, he would encourage his students to work on different topics. And so he never created one Bailey School of History. In fact, I think his students did very, very different kinds of work, from history of science to, and then everything from 17th century to 20th century history, but also it was not just India, but he had students who were working on many parts of the British Empire and of Asia. So I think that he had a vision and a generosity which has benefited so many of us.
Yeah, I asked you this question because now in Japan we have many mentoring systems. I think they work very well, and then so there are many students here too. So it's very nice to have a mentor or supervisor, and the influence we get from these mentors are really, really important. So I just. Yeah, Professor Bailey was so nice, and he influenced me a lot too. We have time still.
Questionnaires. So among them, I summarize a common question among these 5 questionnaires. You have been working on the migration history, particularly crossing the Bay of Bengal. The second book, is paradoxically, under the British Empire, the people moved not only freely, but also compulsorily. They moved relatively easily, but paradoxically, after the Second World War, the end of the war, a nation state emerged among the countries around the Bay of Bengal. So it's a ideology of the nationalist ideology. They controlled the borders strictly. It depends on states, but anyway, strictly controlled and managed by nation state. So people moved not so easily around the Bay of Bengal. So now this nation state, many countries get strong. So how do you solve the common parallel so far your dialogue, but how can you solve these wars of the nation state? And in order to solve the common challenge, do you have any idea or thought on this issue? But I think it's essential question.
I think that is the essential question, and of course, wars between nation states are very much with us in the world that we're living in today, and this is something that is not only a cause of great human suffering, but it is also an obstacle to progress on climate crisis, for example. It's also an obstacle to progress on climate change and various other shared problems. I do think one very interesting example is the success of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which most people probably would not have predicted when it was set up in the 1960s and 1967 that it would become probably the most effective regional organization in the world, especially now that the European Union has lots of problems. ASEAN is becoming more and more integrated. There are some possibilities of relatively free movement across ASEAN countries now for their citizens. There are tensions, there are political problems, but I do think the stronger ASEAN becomes, the less likely I imagine it being that ASEAN states will be in direct conflict with one another. It does seem to be an effective place to solve at least some kinds of problems. It's not been so effective at solving other kinds of problems. The role of Myanmar within ASEAN, for example, has always been controversial, and the question has been raised about whether ASEAN could and should have done more to protect human rights in Myanmar, and that has not been the approach that ASEAN has taken. But in many other ways, ASEAN is very interesting, and I think the contrast comes with South Asia. If you look at SAARC, which has really been very ineffective, and there's very little regional integration in South Asia compared with Southeast Asia. My deeper interest, I suppose, is in a more cultural or human sense, how we can create those solidarities. And I think ultimately that is why I study history. That's why I think many of us study history, because if we look to history, we find that there's not just a single path or a single identity. What we find is diversity. What we find is different ways that Asian cultures have had with interacting with one another, some of which we've forgotten, many of which were open to difference and open to collaboration. And so at the very least, I think we should do more to recover or to reimagine some of those alternative histories.
I have now my own question. Compared with South Asia or East Asia, South Asia is dominant state is there, India, and East Asia, China is very dominant. But Southeast Asia is comparatively equal among the states. The relationship between among the states comparatively equal, and then relationship is more softer than in East Asia. Not so, I think, soft. Not so in South Asia also, because India is very strong, and India doesn't care about neighboring countries, I think. So, but Southeast Asia is much better in that sense. Cooperation can be easy. How do you think? How do you think?
I think that's really true, but what's very interesting is that's quite recent. If you think about the 1960s, Indonesia and Malaysia almost went to war under konfrontasi. If you think about the conflicts, of course, between Cambodia and Vietnam, there have been so many moments where actually Southeast Asian countries have had very, very bad relations with one another. In that context, I think it's all the more remarkable to see how much progress they've made in establishing these relationships of relative equality. I think the other thing that's distinctive about Southeast Asia is, for reasons we probably don't have time to debate here, I think Indonesia has never flexed its muscles. Indonesia is an enormous country, but it has never tried to play a dominant role in Southeast Asia, at least certainly not since for a long time. And because in size, it is dramatically bigger than any of its neighbors. And now, increasingly with economic growth, it is growing very fast. But Indonesia's relations with its neighbors, at least over the last few decades, have tended to be relatively cooperative ones. So some of this may come down to the question of understanding Indonesia better. I mean, Indonesia is a country which you have many amazing Indonesia scholars in Japan. In the United States, Indonesia is a very neglected country. There are fewer and fewer Indonesian specialists. In my university, Yale University, we barely have anybody who studies Indonesia. It's such an important country. So I feel like some part of the answer when it comes to Southeast Asia may lie in understanding Indonesia better.
May I have one more question? So your recent book, just Wakimura sensei talked about the new book, and then I have a question about the new book. Yeah, it was published just 2 days ago. Yeah, yeah, and then a Japanese translation will come later, so please wait for a while. And then I haven't read it yet, and then could you tell us a bit about the content of the book?
Thank you, Kanda-san. So this is the first book that I have written that I call global history. Until then, my work has been more specifically on South and Southeast Asia, so this is my first effort to write on a global scale. But I think that the spirit of Asia is in that book, because I think that even though I do use examples from many different continents, probably the majority are coming from South Asia, Southeast Asia, also East Asia in the case of this book. And in some ways, the question I ask is, what does global environmental history look like if we put Asia at the center of the story? Not always, but as a relatively constant anchor for the whole book. The question the book asks is really, in a way, a very simple question. In a way, it's an impossibly difficult question. The question is, how did we arrive at this point of catastrophic environmental crisis around the world? And one of my focuses is actually, going back to the questions that both of you have asked about peace. I think violence, and particularly the violent pursuit of inequality through empires, is for me probably the single most important driving force of also environmental harm and destruction. And so that's the single most important thread in the book, I think.
Thank you very much. I just wonder, the subtitle is the last 500 years. So which means you start from the 16th century. Is that right?
So it's interesting. The book has two different subtitles. The American one doesn't give a time period. The UK edition says over the last 500 years. That's very approximate. I actually start, very interesting, being in Fukuoka, and Professor Nakamizo and Professor Nomura yesterday took me to see the Mongol Wall. I start with the Mongols. Actually, I see the Mongol Empire as a very environmentally connecting force in many ways, obviously also accompanied by a lot of violence, but it crossed so many ecological zones that it was a very important moment. I would say more than half the book is actually on the last 200 years. It's definitely a history which emphasizes more the modern history, the recent past. So I think 500 years is an approximate subtitle, but it's actually, the starting point is actually the Mongol Empire.
Yeah, just I wonder, there are many environmental history books starts sometime in the 18th century. So just I wonder, before that period, so...
Very good question. I think I wanted to understand, of course, maybe the single most transformative of all transitions in terms of the environment is the energy transition to fossil fuels. And of course, that's why so many histories would start in the 18th century and really get going in the 19th century. I thought it was important to provide a bit of a longer context to that by understanding that, in fact, already before that, early European empires, especially in the Americas, had absolutely catastrophic environmental effects. And of course, human devastation went along with that. And I wanted to use that as a backdrop to then understand what transforms with fossil fuel-based empires in the 19th century.
Thank you very much.
We have still enough time to invite some questions or comments on this lecture. If you have, please raise a hand.
私もうすでに神田先生の方からもご質問があったかと思いますけれども、やはりこの講演で一番強調なさっていたのはそのボーダーですね、その国境であるとか、あるいは実際の国境でなくともそういう他者であるとかですね、そういういろんな人との違いを壁を作ってしまうような、そういうのをどういうふうに克服していくのかっていうようなところが一番強調されていたかと思います。で、そうした時に国際関係とかではなくてですね、もっとヒューマニティーズ、人文科学的なアプローチが非常に重要であるというお話だったかと思いますけれども、教育っていうようなことも強調されてですね、そうした時に、具体的に例えば、私たちも大学とかに勤めている研究者であったり、学生だったりするわけですけれども、何か具体的に我々ができるようなことっていうんですかね、何か先生が、例えばこの福岡の学術賞市民フォーラムといったような形もあるかと思いますけれども、何か先生がやってみたいこととかですね、プラットフォームあるいはプログラムで何かこういうことをやってみたいっていうようなことが、ありましたら教えていただければと思います。
今のご質問に関してね、アムリ先生に私の方からちょっとトランスレートっていうか、何を白山先生がおっしゃったかということを伝えたいと思うんですけど、その際学校訪問っていうのを2日前にされてるんで、その時に何をお話しされたのかっていうのをね、っていうのはすごく教育に関して関心を持っておられるので、そういう実践も実際にその学校訪問でやられてるので、she is asking you what is your educational effort to influence or teach your student in Yale University, or but the day before yesterday you went to school, high school. So what did you say, or what did you show the student practically? Could you explain what did you say to the student, high school student? Yeah, here. It is very, I think she would like to know that kind of things. Yes, please.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say to the Secretariat that it was a wonderful opportunity to be able to visit a school. I visited Futaba High School. I shared a little bit about my work, a little bit also about my career, and they had a lot of impossible questions to answer because they are the deepest questions, and the questions were, how will we confront the future? What subject should I study? That was actually the hardest question I was asked by somebody there. It was, the world is changing so fast, what subjects? How do we know what subjects to study? And that's such a sophisticated question, because it was not, tell me what subject to study, it was, how do I know what subject to study? And I think that might be one of the most difficult questions that I have been asked, because what I said was that in some ways the world is changing so fast that the content of what you study is maybe less important than the habits and approaches that you develop. And I suggested that she wanted to choose something that would fulfill her and keep her interested. She herself was concerned that she was under pressure to study the things that are currently very much fashionable and in the news, particularly to do with AI. And so I think one of the questions was, at the background of that is, what is the value of the humanities in this world that we're living in, where everything comes down to this astonishingly rapid technological change? And I continually tell my students at Yale, but also what I said at the high school, was that I think that so many of the problems we face are technological problems, they are policy problems, but they're also human cultural problems. They have to do with our view of the world, they have to do with our view of others, they have to do with our view of ourselves. And I believe still, and I certainly do try to kind of communicate to students, that the vast archive of human knowledge and creativity is not something that becomes irrelevant just because of the speed of the technological changes that we're dealing with at the moment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sunil-san, and it's my great pleasure to hear such an actually an astonishing talk and very intriguing talk. So thank you very much. And actually, this is especially, it's very interesting to hear that. So how your childhood life in Singapore create a basis of your research life after that. And it's wonderful here that there is a strong line between your life in Singapore and your research life at the moment. And my question is how to understand the risk of environmental fundamentalist idea. So as you said, when you start studying about migration, firstly you think that you should not include the old type eco-fundamentalist idea into your research because then it has risk. But after you have field work for a long time in South Asia, it is not a good idea to reject this kind of, how can I say, influence of nature into an area who are living there for generations. Yeah, but this kind of turn or change in stance may bring you to have to challenge the old days, negative side of environmental fundamentalism. Yeah, actually, the reason why I'm asking you this is that, as you know, you mentioned in your book on Ruri Water on the work of I forgot the name of the Japanese scholar, Tetsuro Watsuji's book. Yeah, and you refer to his book in your book, that his idea on environmental fundamentalism is quite unique. Yeah, of course, in Europe as well, they have this kind of idea. Yeah, but you wrote that in your book that his Tetsuro Watsuji's idea is unique. So in this sense, I think that you may have some idea to overcome, especially European-based environmental fundamentalist idea, and or overcome or revive this kind of traditional idea to a new, more, how can I say, optimistic and creative idea. So if you have, it's my great pleasure if you.
Thank you so much,
yeah.
Professor Nomura. I think that is a question that I'm constantly, I think, wrestling with in my work, because I do believe that, particularly given the conditions that we face, all of us today, it is irresponsible and also unhelpful to ignore nature when we're understanding and trying to explain human history and human institutions. I think the challenge comes in how to do that without giving all of the explanatory power to nature or to climate. And so I think maybe the solution or the path forward is to see, as environmental historians have done for a very, very long time, of course, the kind of mutual influence of human beings and their environment. And the fact that ideas about the environment shape human behavior. It's not necessarily the environment itself, but also how we perceive risk, how we perceive the environment. And that, of course, has had major policy implications that has shaped entire ways of handling nature. And the example that I've thought of many times is that if you look at the generation of policymakers and leaders who took power in Indian independence, they had a real fear of the monsoon. They had this idea that if we don't liberate Indian farmers from rain-fed agriculture, that we will not be able to see through our ideas of development. I mean, of course, in reality, first of all, rain-fed agriculture remains very widespread and very precarious in India, and second of all, the dams and the other big infrastructural projects sometimes had unintended consequences, though they also brought benefits to many people. So in that way, we can think about the environment and we can think about how it shaped modern India, but it's shaping it also through policy, through institutions, through ideas. And maybe that's the way that we avoid returning to an older view. I am a little concerned that there is, in the new field of climate history, or it's an old field which is now once again flourishing, there is a little bit of a tendency to give all of the explanatory power to climate or changes in climate. And I think that what we might want to do is to think about how to nuance that or layer that with thinking about the relationship between environmental change and human ambitions, human institutions.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, Sunil-san, thank you very, very much for your inspiring lecture. Actually, that Wakimura sensei has already picked up my question about the nation state, so I'm wondering what I should say. So that time is not so limited, but yeah, I think that one of your main topic is to try to overcome the framework of nation state. So that means the same question. But so I think that we have a lot of that works on nationalism. But still, you see, I cannot understand why, you see, this national identity is so strong. Yeah, so of course I know this is a very big question, but if you have that any answer about this question, please let us know. Yeah, thank you very much.
Professor Nakamizo, I think your answer to that question would be better than mine, because I've heard you reflect on these questions in very interesting ways. I suppose one thing is that we should not forget that the nation state in the 20th century has been, as well as all of the problems that we know, it's actually been the main source of social mobility for people. And it is still at the level of the nation state that welfare and social security and so many other fundamental goods that have developed over the course of the 20th century, they have been located in the nation state. We could debate, I suppose, for a long time whether that was the only possible institutional form for those kinds of policies. Maybe not. But certainly that is where they were rolled out. And so even if we think about the climate crisis, while at one level I think it does make it urgent to think beyond the nation state, still it's going to be at the level of the nation state that the rehabilitation of displaced people or the relief and compensation that comes to those who've lost their homes are going to come from. And some of that, of course, has to do with the fundamentals of economic history, to do with taxation and to do with resource generation. I mean, one of the things, to go back to my early work, which Professor Wakimura mentioned, I remember being shocked when I found out that the World Health Organization, which was set up with so many ambitions, had a smaller budget than the city of Geneva. And I think that remains the case, that so many of the institutions we've created that do transcend borders don't have anything like the fiscal capacity of nation states. And so that doesn't answer the question of why national identity is so strong. I really think that your insights from political science are essential to our understanding that question. And of course, so much of that also has to do with education and the media. And I often go back to another laureate of this wonderful prize, Benedict Anderson, and his work continues to inspire us, I think, because he pointed to that real deep power of national identity and tried to explain where it's coming from.
Thank you very much. So now almost time has we would like to finish this second part. Thank you very much for joining us.